It's 6:02 a.m. Your banking app shows your balance, but you can't withdraw a single dollar. By 9 a.m., the transfers are frozen. By noon, the headline hits: Emergency Financial Stabilization Act activated. Your money didn't disappear. It was reclassified. You sleep soundly, thinking your bank account is a private fortress. But history tells a brutally different story. When a government's ledger bleeds red, no vault is truly locked. We begin by stripping away the myth of the crusading knight to reveal the cold reality of the 14th century's most powerful, too systemic to fail institution, the Knights Templar, and why King Philip IV decided the easiest way to cure a liquidity crisis was to murder his creditors. In the modern world, when a government runs out of money, they print more. They dilute your purchasing power until your dollar buys a dime's worth of bread. It's a slow, polite robbery. But 7 centuries ago, the King of France didn't own a printing press. He held toxic assets so massive they threatened to swallow his crown, and a creditor too powerful to ignore. So, he didn't devalue the currency. He initiated a forced liquidation of the bankers. Let us open the case file on the Templar eradication. Let's look at the shadow behind the success. To understand the crime, you have to understand the victim. Forget the Hollywood images of knights charging across the desert with blood-stained swords. By the turn of the 14th century, the Knights Templar were poor in name only. They were the world's first multinational investment bank. Imagine walking into their London preceptory. You hand over 50 pounds of silver to a monk bound by a vow of poverty, but armed like a Navy SEAL. In exchange, he doesn't hand you a receipt. He gives you a cryptographic cipher written on sheepskin, sealed with heavy red wax. You cross the English Channel, walk into the Paris branch, hand over the sheepskin, and a teller in a white mantle pays you out in local currency. The Templars didn't just invent the traveler's check. They invented end-to-end encryption. And they skimmed a fee off every single transaction. They managed the estates of nobles. They handled tax collection for popes. They operated a fleet of ships that crowned them the masters of Mediterranean trade. If you wanted to move money across borders without catching a blade in the dark, you went to the men in the white mantles. They were the safest vault in Christendom. But there is a fundamental rule in the physics of finance: counterparty risk. When you become the person everyone owes money to, you eventually become the person everyone wants to see dead. Enter King Philip IV of France, known as the Fair, though his balance sheet was anything but. Philip was obsessed with state sovereignty, a diplomatic word for total control without the inconvenience of paying his bills. By 1306, Philip was drowning in a liquidity crisis. Not because he was reckless, but because the system he ruled demanded constant war, constant spending, and constant debt. He tried the usual parlor tricks. He expelled the Jews to seize their assets, arrested Lombard merchants for protection money, and debased the French coinage until the public rioted in the streets of Paris. Philip had to flee the mob. Ironically, he found refuge in the Temple, the fortified Parisian headquarters of the very men he owed the most. Hiding behind their thick stone walls, he didn't see protectors. He saw a solution. Philip's debt wasn't symbolic. It was estimated at over 2 million livres tournois, roughly an entire year of royal revenue. In modern terms, tens of billions of dollars owed to a single institution. In his eyes, the Templars were no longer a holy order. They were a systemic threat. They paid no taxes, answered only to the Pope, and held the mortgage on his throne. Philip realized a dark truth that modern governments still whisper in closed rooms. The easiest way to balance a ledger is to erase the person holding the pen. On Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip pulled the trigger on the most ruthless, hostile takeover in human history. The heist began before the sun touched the spires of Notre Dame. In the pre-dawn chill of Friday, October 13, 1307, the French state didn't just break the law, it redefined it. The hidden engine wasn't a battle of faith. It was a cold, calculated forensic audit disguised as an inquisition. Philip's operation was a masterpiece of logistics. A month before the raid, royal couriers rode out from Paris carrying lockboxes. Inside were Philip's kill orders, sealed in wax, with a terrifying directive attached, to be opened on pain of death only on the night of October 12th. Without cell phones, without the internet, Philip engineered a perfectly synchronized SWAT raid by candlelight. He knew that if the Templars caught wind of the move, their gold would trigger massive offshore capital flight into their Mediterranean fleet, leaving his hostile takeover with nothing but empty stone vaults. The smoking gun wasn't a sword. It was a legal trick. Philip knew he couldn't just arrest his creditors. That would trigger a sovereign default and destroy his reputation across Europe. So he changed the crime itself. He weaponized moral hazard. By accusing the order of spitting on the cross and worshipping a severed head called Baphomet, Philip shifted the narrative from "the king is broke" to "the king is protecting the soul of France." The scheme followed a ruthless, three-step mechanism. First, he manufactured the evidence. Philip's whistleblower was a criminal named Escu de Floiran. Floiran's testimony was the medieval equivalent of a forged audit, providing the probable cause Philip needed to bypass the Pope's jurisdiction. Second, he executed the sink. At dawn, nearly 15,000 men were dragged from their beds in a coordinated sweep larger than most modern federal operations. In Paris alone, 138 Templars were rounded up, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay. They weren't taken to a courtroom. They were taken to the audit room. Third, he conducted an audit of the flesh. This is where the poetry of the Templar legend meets the cold, clinical reality of the rack. Under the direction of the royal inquisitor, Guillaume de Paris, the state began extracting confessions. This wasn't about the truth. It was an asset seizure regime. Think of it as civil asset forfeiture on a national scale. Between 1307 and 1312, Philip used the machinery of the church to dismantle his debt. If you were a Templar and you refused to confess, you were burned at the stake as a relapsed heretic. If you did confess, the king graciously allowed you to live in poverty while he moved into your headquarters and absorbed your revenue streams. The hard evidence of this betrayal sits in the Vatican secret archives today in a document known as the Chinon Parchment, dated August 1308. This document is the ultimate forensic fact. In modern terms, Pope Clement V wasn't just a religious figure. He was the chairman of the SEC, the only regulator with the authority to audit the Templars. But Philip had achieved total regulatory capture. By moving the entire papacy to Avignon, Philip effectively kidnapped the regulator, putting a gun to the head of the very institution supposed to keep the market honest. The Pope knew the charges were a fiction designed to cover a royal bankruptcy, but he rubber-stamped the corporate slaughter anyway. For 4 years, it looked like Philip had won. And here's the twist. There may have been no gold to take. The Templars weren't sitting on mountains of physical treasure. They were holding something far more dangerous: information. Philip didn't just want the gold in the vaults. He wanted the ledger of debts itself. By liquidating the order, the physical records of who owed what were systematically erased in the chaos. The destruction of the ledger was the real heist. The king's massive loans, millions of gold florins that should have taken generations to repay, simply ceased to exist. The scale of this theft is hard to overstate. We are talking about the seizure of thousands of properties and the erasure of a debt that today would be valued in the tens of billions of dollars. Philip had found the God mode of finance. When you own the judges, the police, and the executioners. Debt is just a word you use to describe people you haven't killed yet. But as every forensic historian knows, when you pull a thread this hard, the whole tapestry starts to unravel. Philip thought he was saving his kingdom. In reality, he was destroying the very foundation of the medieval economy: trust. The smoke that rose from the pyre on the Île de la Cité on March 18, 1314, didn't just carry the scent of charred wood and the remains of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master. It carried the ashes of the medieval financial system. As de Molay burned, he reportedly leveled a curse at King Philip and Pope Clement, summoning them to appear before God's tribunal within a year. Call it divine intervention or the stress of a collapsing economy, but they both died within months. Yet, while the men perished, the Philip strategy survived. It became the hidden operating system for every sovereign power that followed. The reality of the Templar eradication is far colder than the legends of hidden grails or buried gold. The true Templar treasure wasn't a chest of coins. It was the absence of a bill. Philip didn't find the mountain of bullion he expected. He didn't need the gold to win. He had already achieved the ultimate financial alchemy. He had turned a liability into an asset. By seizing the Templars' land, he became the largest landlord in France. By killing the lenders, he turned his debt into zero. This is the sovereign default in its purest, most violent form. In 2026, we like to think we are more civilized. We don't burn bankers on islands in the Seine. We have bail-ins, quantitative easing, and the quiet mechanics of a balance sheet reset. But the mechanism is identical. When a modern state finds its debt unpayable, it doesn't look for a way to earn the money back. It looks for a heresy. It finds a group to blame, be it greedy speculators, foreign adversaries, or the wealthy, and it uses the law to seize, tax, or inflate their holdings into nothingness. You see, the Templars' mistake wasn't their greed. It was their visibility. They built massive stone and mortar preceptories that couldn't be hidden. They kept paper ledgers that could be seized. They relied on a trust that was protected by a compromised regulator who was ultimately just another man with a mortgage. Today, your wealth is more invisible than theirs ever was, tucked away in digital entries and cloud-based portfolios. But as the story of 1307 teaches us, no vault is deep enough to hide from a state that has run out of options. In 1307, the state needed soldiers to seize your wealth. In 2026, it may only need software. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, introduce a new variable, money that can be programmed, restricted, or frozen. Not by breaking the law, but by rewriting its permissions. Philip IV had to use the rack to take their wealth. Tomorrow's governments just need a server update. Philip IV proved that the law isn't a shield for the creditor. It's a weapon for the debtor, provided that debtor has the power to define what heresy looks like this year. Whether it's 1307 or 2026, the rules of the game haven't changed. The only difference is the temperature of the fire. So, as you look at your own too systemic to fail institutions today, ask yourself the uncomfortable question. If the system ever reaches a breaking point, do you think your government would choose to default honestly or redefine the rules and call it stability? Was Philip IV a tyrant, or just the first leader honest enough to admit how the system really works? History suggests you should check your own exits. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.